For the Maya, the sky was not the only otherworldly domain, and the gods of the sky were not the only ones that had to be appeased. Beneath the earth, there lay another vast realm, a supernatural underworld where the spirits of the dead roamed.
For the Mayas, the structure of the world, we are living in the living plane that it's the earth, and then there's the skies with different levels, and of course the underworld. The underworld was the place where the people that are not living anymore are there. So for them, when you die, it's not the end of everything.
In the Popol Vuh, an ancient Mayan narrative, the underworld is called Xibalba, the place of fear. It has 9 perilous levels, ruled by 12 lords, gods of death, who are responsible for disease and affliction. The Maya believe this place of death exists side by side with the land of the living. The underworld could be reached in the most unlikely of places. This huge open court in Chichen Itza looks almost like a marketplace, but no buying or selling went on here. It was the setting for an ancient Mayan ball game, a game far deadlier than any modern sport. Measuring 550 by 230 feet, the court is over twice the size of a modern American football field. Here, 2 teams faced off, with players aiming to hit the ball through hoops high on the walls. They play for the highest possible stakes, because the losing team faces being sacrificed to the gods. The winners kill the losers and cut off their heads. Wall reliefs show the victors holding a loser's severed head. At first glance, the high walls that surround the ball court don't seem to have much purpose. The reason for their existence could lie in the game's religious meaning. An ancient myth from the Popol Vuh explains its origins. In this story, heroic twins play the game with the lords of the underworld. The lords dismember them and burn their remains. The twins are reborn. Emerging from the underworld, they become the sun and the moon.
They die and they revive again every day to remind humans that they got to keep the balance, maybe by making offerings and rituals specifically to the underworld.
Okay, so that's that video. Sorry if this is a little long, but I thought that this was kind of interesting. And then I have this one too. This is just actual footage. Of the game being played. Obviously they're probably not playing for life or death. This is just a modern game that they're doing now. And there's that rubber ball made from the rubber tree. Pretty cool. One of these guys gets a point. There we go. So that's how it's played. Okay, back to our lecture here. Try and get this going. So clay, wax, and plaster are soft, and since they're so soft, sculptures usually start all of the larger pieces with an inner rigid support called an armature. And when clay is modeled to form large sculptures, the total piece can be built in smaller pieces that are separately fired and then added together to make a larger piece, eliminating the need for an armature. But sometimes an armature is needed. And obviously the softer material goes on top of the more rigid core that the armature is made out of, and the armature does help to add rigidity to the piece. So August Rodin, he was actually a really famous sculptor from the late 1800s. We're going to look at a piece called Naked Balzac. He made it with plaster, and he painted it with varnish. It's 29 3/4 inches high. So we'll take a look at that. So here it is. He's probably one of the most known sculptors ever, Auguste Rodin. He used an armature when he constructed this piece. He used it to hold the plaster up as he worked. And he created the sculpture by gradually adding the plaster and working in layers from the innermost layer to the outermost layer. And then when the plaster dried, he removed the armature from the middle. And Balzac was a well-known French author and the literary society had commissioned Rodin to make an honorary statue. So the artist Rodin, he actually studied Balzac's novels and essays, and then this is kind of the piece that he decided to come up with. He thought that this presented the author Balzac in a way that showed his personality, and but society at the time rejected this. So the artist ended up keeping it in his studio since no one else appreciated it. So this is an example of a modeled piece that used an armature as well. So continuing with modeling, here's an example. We're going to take a look at Ken Price's Vink. It's non-representational. From 2009, it's acrylic paint on fired ceramic. So we'll take a look at that. It has kind of a mysterious iridescent quality. So it's actually clay that he modeled, non-representational. And it's out of, clay. He fired it and then he painted it with multiple layers of acrylic paint. And then he also sanded the surface to kind of expose spots of the paint layers below. So that's how he kind of got that modeled surface. He actually sanded that down, and it's just layers of paint that are built up. And the title is referring to a European songbird. And this piece kind of suggests body parts, undersea organisms, knobby plant life. And the unique color and iridescence of the piece add to the mysteriousness of the work. Some might say it kind of resembles something that your dog might leave behind on the sidewalk or in the grass in your neighbor's yard. Okay, so moving on, casting. Casting's the next method that we're going to talk about. Casting involves pouring liquid into a mold and allowing it to harden before removing the mold. So typically an artist will make a work in an easily handled medium such as clay and then use that to create a mold. So they'll make their piece, their sculpture, and then they'll add on top of that and whatever hardens around the piece, they'll use that as a mold. And they use the mold to pour a more permanent material in, such as bronze. So they might start off making a piece in clay, they'll cover it with a molding material, either hard or soft, and then they'll remove the mold, which sometimes means that they end up destroying the original clay sculpture that they made. And then they keep the mold and they fill that with bronze. So they go from clay to bronze with the mold. Casting involves pouring a liquid into a mold and allowing it to harden before removing the mold. Because the casting involves the substitution of one material for another, casting is called a substitution process. Ancient China, Greece, Roman, and parts of Africa used bronze casting, and it's been used in the West for the last 5 centuries, and it's probably the most common medium for like memorial statues in public parks and things like that. Casting requires several steps. First, a mold is made from the original work. The process of making the mold varies depending on the material of the original and the material used in the casting. Materials that will harden can be used to make molds: clay, concrete, or liquid plastic such as fiberglass. Whatever the material, the mold completely surrounds the original piece, leaving no gaps. Second, the original sculpture is removed from the mold after the mold is dry. And this might require the disassembly of either the original or the mold, but usually the mold will just be cut in half, and then they can put it back together to make it whole again. And then they would add the last step, the casting liquid, most often molten bronze, is poured into the resulting hollow cavity of the mold. And when the casting liquid or bronze has hardened, the mold is actually removed. And that's kind of the whole process in a nutshell. Some casting processes use molds of flexible materials that allow many casts to be made from the same mold. But sometimes you can only make one because it will completely destroy the mold that you made. It just kind of depends on what it's made out of. So the last wax process that actually makes a mold that's possible for later use. So if you do lost wax process, you can save your mold and reuse it. Like I said, in some other methods that are, casting methods, you might only be able to make one piece because the mold would be destroyed. Okay, so the cost and weight of the material often help to determine which casting method will be used for a specific work. So the book mentions the Statue of Liberty in New York, and it was cast in many pieces and assembled on site. And it does have an armature holding it up. It's quite elaborate. The process for casting larger bronze statues is extremely complicated. So most artists turn to their originals over to foundry experts who actually make the molds and do the casting. And most of our monuments and state parks are cast and done from clay or wax models by artists that they then turn over to a foundry, and then the foundry makes it. Let me go over this last lost wax process. I kind of forgot to go over that. So let's say they have an armature of this clay core, and then they add wax over the top, and they create this face, and this is what they want to make. And they actually will add this on the end so that they can flip it. Oops, dang it. Sorry, guys. I'll have to bring this back. So they'll add this on for the purpose, they'll eventually cut that off again once it's done, but they add that on so that they can pour the liquid bronze in there or whatever type of metal they might be using. But it actually helps the metal pour into the form of the face. And then they put a layer of clay. Once they're done with this piece, they'll put a layer of clay around that with no gaps so that this form is completely embedded inside of this clay piece, which will become the mold. And then they probably heat this whole thing up and then just drain the wax out so it's completely hollow in there. So this whole thing is inside of here, and they just melt that wax out, and then they pour that molten metal inside, and then they break it out, and then they probably saw off, this piece that they added just to help, pour in the molten metal. So that's kind of the lost wax process. I guess I'll show this video to you guys. So they're using silicone. And he has that original piece that he put inside there. He probably made that from by hand. Probably a pretty laborious process. And this is jewelry making, but they are using a casting process. So he's got his mold. He's putting wax. And now he has a copy. And he just makes those over and over again from that same mold. And he's making a wax. He's actually making a tree. Because when he goes to fire this, or when he goes to make these, he can have like 30 or 50 of them made. plaster around his little